Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what is making the headlines with the columnist at the newspaper, Ian Dunt, and Anita Boateng, a broadcaster and former Conservative special advisor, both with us from now until just before midnight. Welcome to both of you. So let's take a look, shall we, at the front pages. This week's rail strikes featuring on the front page of the Financial Times with the headline, Rail Union Resists as Bosses Offer 3% pay rise for 2,000 job cuts. While the Yorkshire Post focuses on businesses' fears over the impact on trade caused by the national strikes, the headline reading, retailers and pubs in plea to sort out rail issues. The Sun labels this week's rail strikes and threatened strikes by teachers the start of a class war. The Eye looks at the government's proposed laws to limit future strikes, saying they won't fix the crisis. They think it's all Uber. It is now, reads the Daily Star, which reports that MPs were told to avoid today's travel chaos by claiming taxi trips and hotel stays back on expenses. Tory bill accused of fatally weakening human rights after a Strasbourg judge blocked the deportation of asylum seekers to Rwanda. That story is on the front page of The Guardian. The Telegraph's front story is on the inflation-linked double-digit increases to go ahead to state pension and benefits, despite the government telling workers to accept a real terms pay cut. Gold age pensions, a simple headline from the Metro on that same story. Well, a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen right now, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. So let's return to our guests then. Columnist at the Eye, Ian Dunt, and Anita Boateng, broadcaster and former Conservative special advisor. We'll certainly come on to those figures on pensions in just a moment. But first of all, Ian, your assessment of today, the rail strike, the impact and what happens next.
Well, what does that say? I mean, it's always a failure. Like, if you get to the point where there's a strike, everyone has failed. Management has failed, the unions have failed. In this case, also the government has failed, because despite its repeated claims that it can't go anywhere near the negotiating table, it is, of course, the decisions are contingent on the decisions it makes. It controls the kind of funding that you're looking for National Rail. It needs to be there, and yet it's done nothing to help the situation. And in fact, has spent most of the last 2 weeks, as far as I can tell, making social media memes about Keir Starmer somehow being responsible for the strike. So it seems to be sort of in this quite unseemly way, almost enthusiastic about the strikes, let alone being able to do anything to help. And there's very little sign at the moment that it's going to be any better for the rest of the week. And like I say, that is a failure in pretty much every direction you can consider.
Well, indeed so. And, the impact being lessened or cushioned by, everybody's experiences during the pandemic, working from home where they can. Does that drag the strike out? Does that mean that the rail action by the union is neutered in any way? Does it have any impact at all, Anita?
Well, I would say that I'm struck by the fact that normally the papers following a strike day would have pictures of sort of empty London and old people, kind of enormous queues of people on for buses and that kind of thing. But I can't see any of that on the front pages. So it might be an indication that obviously office workers who can often work from home and are choosing to have a hybrid model mostly in business, that we're actually seeing that reflected through in response to days like today. But can I just respond to some of what Ian was saying about the government's role in this? I do sort of wonder when people say, well, the government needs to do more. That essentially means the government needs to put some money on the table. And it's clear from the RMT's expectations, which seem to be sort of around 7%, and what bosses are being offered, which is around 3% as reported in the FT, that's quite a big kind of gulf. And the role that the government would play would basically be in funding. And it feels to me, as we've just been talking about the kind of hybrid working, that the ways in which we use the rail service in general are going to change, and that really has to be engaged with. And I'm not convinced, I'm not entirely sure what people mean when they say the government needs to do more, because that feels to me like it just means the government needs to give needs to provide additional funding to either, I don't know, National Rail, etc., to be able to pay the workers more and prevent the kind of redundancies that are going to be needed to reshape the rail service for the future.
Yeah, I mean, this is not just about pay, is it? There's been a lot of coverage of pay, inflation, matching pay required, but a lot of this is about changing to working conditions. The Sunday Times talking about the closure of all ticket offices, which makes consumers sit up and take notice as well. So how much is this about the need for progress to increase, productivity, I suppose, is the best way to describe it, Ian. And how much is the criticism of the union being Luddite, effectively, a genuine one?
Well, their financial claim, I think, is relatively modest. It's still 4 points below inflation. Inflation's about 11. They're asking for 7%. I mean, I do think that's modest, and I think that's reasonable in its own terms. Where you get into more dangerous territory is with reluctance to adopt new practices. Now, we don't really know what the details are of this, but it's certainly true the unions are quite reticent about giving you information, yes, on ticket offices, but also on things that seem more reasonable, for instance, like the use of drones to assess tracks. All of that, of course, can have an impact on members. And sometimes unions are well within their rights to complain about them, but looking at it from a sort of broader societal point of view, you think, well, that's the kind of thing that you could do. So yes, it can go both ways. The financial claim might be stronger. Some of the working conditions claims might not be so strong. The trouble is, it's not really about the claims themselves. It's about how viable a negotiation you have. If you have a party that is key to the decisions that are made, and the government is key to it, we all understand on any political analysis that part of the reason the government wants to be tough on this strike is because it cannot afford to be seen to be soft on it, knowing that it's got teacher strikes potentially coming down the tracks, that barristers are about to go on strikes, that there's probably going to be male strikes, that we're essentially in the beginning of a summer of discontent. So on that basis, if you've got a room with two negotiating partners, but in reality there is a third partner who is not in the room and pretending that it has nothing to do with it, while in fact being completely contingent for the outcome, that doesn't seem like the most conducive environment to get the result that you want.
Well, certainly the Sun picks up on what you were saying about the teaching unions, saying the National Education Union has told Number 10 it wants 12% pay rises for its members by September, 12%. And we move on, if you don't mind, to the Metro, which is talking about a double-digit increase in pensions for older people. Retirees set to see double-digit payments increases next year, as the state pension will be determined based on September's CPI inflation. Now, is it difficult for the government to defend, do you think, that pensioners will get that much money when still trying to draw a halt on pay increases for example, public sector workers, Anita?
I think it's always been really tricky, the balancing act that the government has to strike between pensioners and those of working age. I mean, one of the elements of this, of course, is, first of all, there is a commitment that was suspended during COVID of an increase of 2.5% RPI or CPI, I believe. But it feels to me like the difference for most pensioners is that they don't usually have other ways of making more money. They can't work longer hours and get more pension, right? And so the government's always had a sticky situation, particularly because pensioner poverty was, for instance, such a huge factor in the sort of late sort of 2000s. And that, I think, is a kind of element of the Conservative government's commitment so much to ensuring that pensioners do not, given they don't have revenue, they don't make money and they don't have jobs and have income, that their living standards do not fall too far behind. But it's certainly not a comfortable thing for the government at the moment, given it's trying so hard to stop the inflation tiger from running too far away.
Quick one from you on this as well, Ian. I think the last pension increase was 3.1%, which came in April this year. This was after the pension triple lock was suspended during the pandemic. Benefits will also go up as well. The Telegraph suggesting this will cost the taxpayer as much as £20 billion. The question now, can it still hold the line on fiscal discipline for the working age population? What do you reckon?
No, I mean, the argument's completely inconsistent. I mean, if you're sat there saying that people going out to work are going to have to suffer the pain, but pensioners, people on benefits, are not, that doesn't make sense. The right argument is actually, yeah, this is correct, that we see pensions rise, that we see benefits rise, that you have to protect people while inflation takes place. And that will itself have an inflationary effect. There's no point pretending otherwise. it will contribute to inflation. But that's not all that inflation is. We know that it's coming from external shocks as well, for instance, energy prices as a result of Ukraine and various other factors connected with COVID. This is the kind of pain that inflation involves. The one thing you can do as a government is try to protect people while it is there and minimize the extent to which that has an impact. But there's no possible coherent, consistent argument that says that there's a moral distinction between those cases and the cases that we're talking about which are affected by the strike.
Well, I think we get the next inflation update, don't we, tomorrow morning, so we'll certainly keep an eye on that. Both of you stay there. Lots more still to come, including the front page of The Guardian. A Tory bill accused of fatally weakening human rights. This after a Strasbourg judge blocked the deportation of asylum seekers to Rwanda. We'll discuss that next. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me now, the columnist at the newspaper, Ian Dunt, and Anita Boateng, broadcaster and former Conservative special advisor. Welcome back to both of you. Anita, let's head to The Guardian. This idea that a Bill of Rights will be published. Tell us more and how it fits in with the so-called Rwanda plane that we remember so well.
Well, the interesting thing is that this has been a conversation, and certainly the Justice Secretary Dominic Raab has been a strong advocate of reforming the the Human Rights Act, which was introduced in kind of 1998 and enshrined the European Convention on Human Rights, which is nothing to do with the EU, as I'm sure your readers well know, but it was actually something that came out of the Second World War and is really about enshrining universal rights across Europe to ensure that people's rights to, for instance, the most controversial one, family life, are protected. And the idea behind the British Bill of Rights is to basically probably in the words of Dominic Raab, the kind of elastic approach that some might argue the courts have taken to implementing the European Convention on Human Rights, and have something that feels more, I guess, stripped back. I've got to say, as a Conservative, I struggle to get particularly exercised about the European Convention on Human Rights in a negative sense of the word. But in any case, the government is pushing ahead with what's been in manifestos in years past, and certainly in 2019, to bring this Bill of Rights to the floor of the House and get it straight through Parliament. And part of that conversation is very wrapped up in the incident from last week, which your viewers will recall, where the European Convention on Human Rights was a decisive factor in the decision for many people who were on board of that Rwandan flight not to be allowed to take off. Essentially, the argument that the courts made, that was successfully made to the courts, was that some permanent possible damage might be done if people were removed before there was an opportunity for a full judicial review to take place of the government's policy.
Yes, certainly some Tories were exercised, weren't they, that an out-of-hours judge in Europe decided the fate of that plane. A short minute Daily Telegraph story, which is that the UK PM will urge France and Germany to strengthen their support for Ukraine, Ian.
So he should. There's been this constant bafflement about the kind of rhetoric that comes from Scholz and from Macron. It's kind of mercurial, requires decoding. Macron's perpetual attempts to suggest that in some way Putin must not be humiliated. There's lots of the actions are good. I mean, there's been an underestimation of the kind of arms exports that Germany's been sending over. But in terms of the rhetoric, it's really, really quite mercurial. And it's about time that they firmed it up. So no, anyone that can put pressure on them to try and fix their line would be very welcome indeed.
Ian Dunt, Anita Boateng, thanks both very much indeed.